By late August 1945, World War II, the largest conflict in the history of humankind, was nearing its end. But even at this late stage, blood was still being shed. On the Kuril Island chain in the North Pacific, Soviet and Japanese troops faced off against one another in a battle that would define their bilateral relations and broader geopolitics for generations to come. This is the story of Shumshu, World War II's final major battle. August 1945. War in Europe has been over for 3 months, the Allied forces victorious. But in the East, the bloody, drawn-out struggle rages on. The bloodbath of Okinawa only reached its conclusion 6 weeks earlier. Now, American forces in the Pacific are grappling with the possibility of a lengthy invasion of the Japanese home islands. Even in their death throes, the Imperial armies are certain to inflict heavy Allied casualties. But then, on August 6th, a devastating, unprecedented blow, the atomic bomb of Hiroshima. Somehow, Japan's Supreme War Direction Council votes to fight on, believing that the Americans can't have many more of these bombs. 2 days later, President Truman receives the news his predecessor, Roosevelt, had pushed for at Yalta. The USSR declares war on Japan. Just after midnight on August 9th, 1.5 million Soviets pour across the border into Manchukuo, northeastern China. The Soviet forces comprise the Trans-Baikal Fronts and the 1st and 2nd Far Eastern Fronts, a vast force. Fresh, but inexperienced. Still, after bitter fighting, they're able to smash the exhausted and demoralized Japanese. While the Soviets mount their assault, an American plane is taking off from the Mariana Islands in the South Pacific. A single B-29 named Boxcar drops its grim nuclear payload, this time on Nagasaki. With another nuclear attack and a Soviet invasion, it was all over for the Japanese. But perhaps not quite all over. Though the Japanese made their intention to surrender clear on August 15th, there was still one bit of business left unfinished, the Kuril Islands, connecting northern Japan to far eastern Russia. Once a part of the Russian Empire, these islands had been Japanese since the late 19th century. But Russia wasn't just out to settle old scores. Controlling the islands meant controlling the northern channels between Japan and Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. For the Japanese, losing the islands would mean ceding more of Japan's limited soil to her enemies. If Japan was able to rebuild, she'd need to keep as much of that territory as possible. The fog hung thickly on the straits between Russia and the most northerly and most fortified of the Kurils, Shumshu. 195 miles separated the Soviets from their target. It would take 24 hours to cross, and the Russians were running out of time. If they wanted to take the Kurils, they'd have to land their forces before the Japanese officially surrendered. General Alexei Gnechko headed the operation, and at 5 a.m. on August 17th, they began their crossing. Gnechko was worried. The flotilla had few guns, and once they got into Japanese artillery range, there would be little the boats could do to defend themselves. They'd need to rely on surprise. The Japanese were well aware of Soviet interest in the islands, but they didn't expect a dangerous amphibious assault so late in the conflict. So the first wave of Soviet craft caught the defenders unawares. At 4:30 a.m. on August 18th, 1,000 Red Army troops landed, surprising the Japanese positions. This was the full extent of Russia's early good fortune, however. The inexperienced Soviet troops made chaotic and disjointed attempts to push further inland and take Japanese positions. The more experienced Japanese troops were able to repel the advance, and by 5:30, the element of surprise was lost. The defenders manned their guns and defenses and began laying down heavy fire on the invaders. Not only had the Red Army failed to push inland, they'd also failed to secure the landing ground. As the second wave approached around 5:30 a.m., they were met with withering Japanese fire, losing 5 landing craft. But some craft were getting through. While the second wave was coming ashore, survivors of the first tried to ease the barrage. They launched an assault on the Cape Kokutan artillery batteries, but failed, and once again, they fell back to the beach. Now, the Japanese launched their own assault. Backed with 20 tanks, Japanese infantry tried to drive the Soviets from beaches. Somehow, Russian troops held them off, taking out 15 Japanese tanks in the process. The Russians couldn't press home this advantage, but now they knew that they had a chance. Still, by 9:10 a.m., the Soviets were in a desperate situation. Men were now piled on the beaches with nowhere to go. They were taking casualties and running low on ammunition. But then, a breakthrough. They established radio contact with the guns at Cape Lopatka, the wild and remote tip of Kamchatka, less than 10 miles from Shumshu. When these guns opened up, the impact was immense. Now, the Japanese found themselves under artillery fire, and the Soviet troops set about strengthening their position. As the weather began to clear toward the afternoon, Soviet planes began hitting the naval base on Pamushiro, blocking any relief that might come Shumshu's way. The Japanese forces were isolated, and the tide of battle was shifting toward Russia. By the evening, the beachhead that the Soviets were supposed to have set up that morning was finally established. It was a case of better late than never for the Red Army, and artillery pieces and mortars began flooding ashore. This essentially sealed the fate of the remaining Japanese garrison. Throughout the night, Soviet troops launched brutal raids across the island, overwhelming exhausted Japanese defenders. As the Japanese artillery was now out of action, Soviet craft could move unimpeded across the straits. At first light, the heavy artillery came ashore. The war had already been lost by the Empire of Japan. For her troops on Shumshu, thoughts were now turning toward home, toward family, toward not losing their lives in a desperate attempt to cling on to territory. The dogged determination that had characterized Japanese military tactics throughout the war was fading. So, on the morning of August 19th, Japanese units began to surrender. A ceasefire came into effect at 4 p.m., and by 6 p.m., the islands of Shumshu, Paramushiro, and Onikotan surrendered to the Soviets. Small groups of soldiers did continue fighting the invaders over the coming week. However, by August 23rd, all Japanese troops on the island had surrendered. On September 2nd, the instrument of surrender was signed aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The war was over, and Shumshu gained the dubious honor of being its very last major battle. 962 Soviet troops lost their lives taking the Kuril Island chain. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers died. Such was the weight of Soviet losses that some believe it dissuaded Russia from pushing further into Japanese territory. Had the USSR taken the Kuril Islands easily, they may have turned their attention to Hokkaido. Instead, those plans were shelved. Japan's rugged defense of Shumshu in those first hours may have hastened the end of the war in the Pacific. Today, the Kurils are still under Russian control. The strategic value of an island chain linking Kamchatka to Japanese Hokkaido is just too high for Russia to let it go. Ownership of the islands is a sensitive subject in Moscow and Tokyo, but relations have remained frosty but cordial. Despite the tragic loss of life, Shumshu feels like a footnote to the war, a coda that signified its approaching end. But this often forgotten battle shaped the geopolitics of the Northern Pacific for decades after, and still does to this day. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new, and we hope to see you in the next one.